I don't know who else got the Facebook message about being exposed to extremist content last week. And while it's you don't want to get overly worked up about social media sort of driven topics, I do think there's something very interesting about this issue. Because really, if you look at, for example, at the justification from it, it was Facebook trying to make the case that, oh, well, the biggest issue we have right now is, of course, the M-word, misinformation, which they love using for all sorts of purposes right now, with the intent of triggering an emotional response from the viewers. And that is what big tech is telling us is the biggest threat to democracy. It's not ballot harvesting, it's not voter ID, it is social media content that they do not approve of, sparking an emotional response from people that they think they're smarter than. And what's interesting is if you look through just this past year, about the intersection of fact-checking and big tech, I think it really highlights exactly where this cover of extremism is going in terms of our relationship with the federal government. After all, it wasn't quite Facebook, but YouTube, which all these companies now have similar policies, right? YouTube banned a medical roundtable with Governor DeSantis because the recommendations of his medical officials that he brought in about masking children went against CDC guidelines. And so therefore, the governor of Florida, having an official panel on this topic, had his content removed. Of course, I think like 2 weeks later, the CDC ended up confirming the opinion of Governor DeSantis' medical officers, but it's neither here nor there. Later last year, or even earlier last year, the website Zero Hedge had their Twitter account taken offline because they ran a story questioning out loud whether the virus was manipulated in a Chinese government lab. And of course, we then found out a couple months ago with the release of Dr. Fauci's emails that Dr. Fauci's team was taking this hypothesis very seriously, acknowledging that there were some very interesting indicators there. And yet because the zeitgeist dictated that, oh, this is outside the realms of approvable opinion, Zero Hedge got taken down from a Twitter account for disagreeing with the narrative. A narrative that, again, looks pretty truthful right now. One of the things they're using as the cover of this, of course, the incidents on January 6th. Some of the experiences that Tucker Carlson has been having in this past month. A couple of weeks ago, he had a man from Revolver News who was talking about, making a big deal about the fact that it appears that there were multiple FBI informants that were on the ground with the protesters that ended up in the Capitol during January 6th. And what's interesting is as soon as Tucker Carlson starts talking about this narrative, you have all these people saying, oh, this is outlandish, oh, this is a conspiracy theory, oh, this is deranged. Well, it's interesting because prior to this, the New York Times, talking about FBI investigators helping to entrap individuals online, was widely understood as being a common method of investigation after 9/11. Harvard's had their legal journal had various studies on this and raising concerns about this being an instrument that the FBI had become overly reliant upon. And then here, fast forward to 2021, and now we're told that this is an outlandish idea. Of course, shortly thereafter, Tucker Carlson learns that not only had the NSA been tapping into communications that he had, it turns out now, I guess he was looking to do an interview with Russian President Putin, which NBC News did a couple weeks ago or months ago. So this is not hardly some sort of extreme action. The idea that the NSA is tracking people that are representatives of the government of Russia, not particularly surprising, right? I mean, this is their entire argument is, oh, we only focus outside. The interesting thing, though, is when you have people within the NSA who read these messages and then choose to leak them to the press for political purposes. That, I think, falls without, again, the standard mission of security apparatus. But the problem is that this intersection between big tech and national security agencies is becoming far too tight. They've become the enforcement arm in many ways to try to get content that goes with outside the narrative off of social media platforms. Now, the thing is that the Biden administration has been here for less than a year now. This didn't come out of nowhere, and I think it's really interesting. I don't know if you remember back in 2009, the Biden or the Obama Department of Justice, or Department of Homeland Security, excuse me, with a Secretary Napolitano, had a right-wing terrorist watch list about all of the indicators on why the real concern is not any other. The biggest concern for terrorism in the U.S. was right-wing extremists with Gadsden flag bumper stickers. And it's interesting because I was revisiting that report when I was preparing this presentation tonight, and some of the indicators that they are concerned with being used to foment extremism may have some relevance with the world we live in right now. So the number one concern was economic hardship and the way that plays into extremism. And of course, the past few months now, what have we seen? We've seen gas prices gone up. We've seen inflation rate of 5 percentage points right now, which is well above the 2% acceptable realm that the Fed says it's committed to. We've also seen jobless rates continually underperform. So perhaps, just perhaps, there's some economic hardship that might be used to frame potential extremist activity. Second one was illegal immigration. And of course, what we've seen this past month is I think it's now been shown that illegal border crossings are at one of the highest it's been in the last 10 years. Legislative and judicial drivers concerning people about infringements upon their Second Amendment rights and other issues. The Biden administration has nominated to head Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms a man named David Chipman, who has gone on the record as saying that he believes that committing hate speech online to justify losing your right to bear arms. One of the more interesting ones is the concern, the perceived threat from rise of other countries. Of course, there's nothing this past year that have given us any reason to fear the rise of China and other countries. They had this past week, they actually had the 100th year celebration of the Chinese Communist Party. It's very interesting. Chairman Xi had a wardrobe that looked very much like Chairman Mao. I think there might be some messaging there, some saber rattling about how they will not be intimidated by the U.S. And the last, but I think perhaps most importantly, is concerns about disgruntled military veterans. Of course, what would military veterans have to be disgruntled over right now? At the same time, military leadership, you had a General Mark Miley out there talking about defending the teaching of critical race theory within military bureaucracy. You have the military, again, going back to this connection between big tech and the surveillance state. You have the military outsourcing, vetting social media behavior of military service members, because if they use a third party, use big tech to do it, they get around constitutional concerns. Interesting how that works. Even more telling is that there is a new assistant to the Secretary of Defense, Bishop Garrison, who is in charge of creating these inclusion programs for the Pentagon. His official title is Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Diversity and Inclusion. Sounds like a strong military defense. Here's some of his tweets from just 2019. Silence from our congressional leaders is complicity. Trump is only going to get worse from here, and his party and its leadership are watching it happen while doing nothing to stop it. Support for him, a racist, is support for all of his beliefs. But maybe there's some room for nuance. Let's go on. He's dragging a lot of bad actors, misogynists, extremists, other racists, out into the light, normalizing their actions. If you support the president, you support that. There is no room for nuance with this. There is no more, but I'm not like that talk. Again, this is the person currently in charge of vetting the acceptable behavior from the military. And so understand this is what they've done. They've set a trap. We now have the conditions that they themselves, back in 2009, have identified as being a catalyst for what they consider to be right-wing extremism. They've identified that the truthfulness of content, if it goes against the narrative, if it questions the government line, is itself justification for removal of content and banning and deplatforming and all of that. Again, the truthfulness does not matter. And they're doing this as a way of trying to silence the debate and discussion. Now, there's a lot of troubling aspects of this. First and foremost, is the fact that one of the things that I think it's important to understand is that all this is happening within a city that has, again, the most powerful tools that a government has ever had. We're residing in a city where you literally have 537 members democratically elected. So this is not a democratic wielding of power. This is a bureaucratic state immune from elections that have established a bureaucracy melding with corporate America to impose limits on our speech and our behavior that they themselves recognize would be illegal if the government itself did them, right? Even more perverse still is that this same city has injected itself into the market through the actions of the Federal Reserve, through the regulatory structure, through subsidies, government contracts, right? Who's the biggest contractor for Amazon? It is the Pentagon using their web services. So they have now, so the same city, which again has a total of 537 representatives, democratically elected, representing 330 million people, have created systemic economic incentives that gives corporate America, that would punish corporate America if they dare go against the agenda of this isolated city. Because these are structural issues here that cannot be solved by elections alone. So the question is, what do we do about it? One of the things I think is very encouraging is that you're starting to get a little bit of pushback from a broader coalition of people. I think even now, like some of the people that should be the most attuned to how dangerous this is would be like, old school leftists, like Noam Chomsky, for example. Noam Chomsky's politics are horrible, but his entire academic background was talking about this idea of manufactured consent, the idea that by using corporate media outlets, the government can control the narrative in a way to get the public to vote on things that they otherwise would not support. Okay, what disrupted the corporate press? What disrupted these institutions of power? First and foremost, the number one disruptor was Rush Limbaugh, with the way that talk radio helped interject a new narrative in the political conversation that you did not have when you simply dealt with network news, right? Then you had the rise of the internet with blogs, with social media, with Facebook, such as you people here in this room, talking about political content in ways that perhaps NBC and ABC would not approve of. This is why they're waging this war on big tech. Dissensionist opinion, because the more that we speak out, the more that we question the narrative. I don't care if it is on COVID-related issues. I don't care. I guarantee you, this is one of my predictions going forward, is that pretty soon they're going to start cracking down on reporting real prices out in the economy. Because the biggest danger they have, the Federal Reserve right now is terrified of people losing faith in its ability to control inflation. You've seen this pass in other regimes. Some regimes, they'd actually arrest you if you properly priced your goods, right, because it went against the narrative. I think this is the sort of stuff that we're going to see coming here, because what really allows and empowers the federal government is dictating the acceptable means of conversation. This is what Orwell taught us. This is what all those dystopian novels that we were told to read in school, but not encouraged to actually soak in the lesson. This is what is coming. And so that's one of the things that we as Floridians, we as Republicans throughout the country, we need to recognize that the biggest threat we have right now is this massive security state that is isolated beyond our control and has identified conservative America as being outside the realms of acceptable opinion. That when they talk about extremists and extremist content, they're not talking about Yale professors that are speaking in front of college classrooms, fantasizing about murdering white people. They're not talking about the San Francisco Gay Men's Choir singing about how they're coming after your kids. That was a viral video on Twitter today. They're not talking about tearing down statues of George Washington or critical race theory or any of this sort of stuff. They're talking about a very specific form of extremism. And quite often that simply means telling the truth when the government does not want it to be out there. Whenever the federal government threatens the use of antitrust laws or things like that, you typically have these corporations bend further to the left rather than trying to replace some sort of neutral law there. Yes, because you can imagine this: if you are if you were a large tech giant, think about Elon Musk. I've got plenty of problems with Elon Musk, but Elon Musk has to look over his shoulder for the SEC getting his business on a daily basis. Mark Cuban got slapped with the BS SEC securities thing. The regulatory code is so complex. And if you are a powerful decision maker in a billion-dollar corporation, there's enough ways that they can hurt you that if you don't play the game, they undercut you. I mean, back in the day, Bill Gates used to brag that Microsoft came from the other Washington, and he would talk about how few lobbyists he has. And then the Clinton administration put antitrust measures against Microsoft, and what happened? Microsoft hired an army of lobbyists to protect themselves, and then when they protected themselves, they then used the army of lobbyists against other tech competitors. It's this arms race, and that's the problem. That's why the federal government doesn't solve these things. Again, decentralization, having states defend their residents. We have a lot more control here. We have a lot more influence over what goes on in Tallahassee than we do with, again, a isolated capital. Again, has a total of 537 elected representatives to represent 330 million people. Yes, Brett.
Why has Florida done so well, and what could the rest of the country learn from Florida's example?
Well, I think there's two things that are key. For one, 3 Trump tweets gave us Ron DeSantis. And if you simply compare, and again, this is the easy answer, but I mean, Ron DeSantis has acted like a governor the way that few other Republican executives have. And what we've seen is that's remarkable what happens when you have an executive willing to do both things. The other side of it, though, is I do think there's an advantage that that Florida has in terms of the way that we have term limits, for example, on our state legislative offices. Texas doesn't. And so Texas, you have a lot of the same people that have been in office for a very, very long time. You have very entrenched dynasties there. We've also had 2 outsiders elected to the Republican, to Florida's governor's mansion last year. And Rick Scott was outside of politics. Ron DeSantis came from D.C., which is a little bit different. In Texas, last 30 years, only 1 governor in the entire state of Texas did not come from a previously held statewide position, and that was George W. Bush, which is, kind of different there. The lieutenant governor, which in the state of Texas actually has a lot more power than the governor does in a lot of ways. The lieutenant governor has always been the lane commissioner. And so you have this next man up mentality of Texas politics, for example. And I'm not assume any of these people are bad. It's just that you don't get new ideas that way. You kind of think within a fixed framework. A lot of your appointments are dictated by political loyalty rather than merit. Whereas someone like Ron DeSantis that comes in without a lot of friends in Tallahassee, he ended up appointing a lot of people that were, Adam Putnam endorsers, but were really good at the job, like Richard Corcoran, who's a great education secretary. And so again, I think there's something to be said about genuine disruption in terms of personnel. And Florida's had that in a way that a lot of these other states haven't had. We also have had just a lot of really good support. You have the James Madison Institute. We've had a lot of really good institutions in Florida that have helped create some really good solutions there. It also helps that we have the least amount of spending per person of any state in the country, which just allows for a lot. That means you have a lot less strings attached to a lot of things, and that I think helps as well. So again, Florida, there's a lot of things that are building up to allow Florida to be the most attractive place in the free world. But I'm just thankful that we get to enjoy the fruits. With that being said, again, thank you again for joining us. I hope to see you next month.